The cold was a constant companion, a presence that had seeped into the very grain of the wooden bench and now worked its way through the thin wool of Nora Lee's coat. It was not a violent cold, not the kind that whipped and tore at a person with the fury of a Kansas blizzard. This was a quiet, insistent cold, the kind that settled deep in the bones and reminded a body of its own fragile warmth. For 3 days, it had been her shadow as the train chugged relentlessly westward, leaving the flat, familiar plains behind for a landscape that grew starker and more imposing with every turn of the iron wheels. The glass of the window was filmed with soot and frost, a gray veil over a white world. Through a small patch she'd cleared with her gloved thumb, Nora watched the land pass by. It was a panorama of silence. Snow lay thick and unbroken, blanketing everything in a profound peace that felt both beautiful and menacing. The trees, skeletal and black against the white, stood like sentinels guarding secrets she couldn't yet fathom. Occasionally, a curl of smoke from a distant, unseen chimney was the only sign that another living soul existed in this vast emptiness. Nora was 27 years old, an age when many women in the year of 1878 were already mothers to a brood of children, their hands softened by dough and reddened by lye soap. Nora's hands were different. They were clean, meticulously so, the nails trimmed short, the skin smooth but for the faint, puckered lines of old caustic burns from carbolic acid. They were the hands of a nurse, hands that had measured laudanum and spooned broth, hands that had bathed fevered brows and, most damningly, hands that had closed the eyes of the dead. In Kansas, she had been the nurse for the consumptives. It hadn't been a choice so much as a designation. When the coughing sickness had taken hold in the county, settling like a grim fog in the lungs of farmers and merchants alike, the other women, the good, God-fearing women, had shied away. They had their husbands, their children, their own lives to protect from the specter of the bloody handkerchief and the rattling breath. Nora, an orphan with no husband and no prospects, had been deemed suitable for the task. She had nothing, and therefore nothing to lose. So she had stepped into the sick rooms, into the shadowed spaces where life was measured in shallow breaths. She had learned the geography of suffering, the map of pain etched on a person's face. She had become an expert in the quiet art of easing a soul from its failing vessel. But in doing so, she had become tainted. In the eyes of the town, she had touched death too often. The stain of it, they imagined, clung to her like the cloying scent of sickness itself. It wasn't spoken of in outright accusations. Not usually. It was in the way mothers would subtly pull their children closer when she passed in the street. It was in the way the shopkeeper would place her change on the counter, a small wooden island between his hand and hers, rather than risk their skin meeting. It was in the sudden hush that fell over a group of women quilting on a porch when she drew near. They did not see Nora Lee, the woman. They saw a harbinger, a vessel of the very thing they feared most. No one had ever truly held her, not in her memory. Her parents were vague, shadowy figures from a childhood cut short by fever. The matron at the orphanage was stern and efficient. Her touch meant only for correction or instruction. And as a woman, the simple, casual affection others took for granted was a foreign country. Men who might have come courting were warned away by their cautious mothers. Women who might have offered friendship saw her as a walking reminder of mortality. She existed in a space just outside the warmth of human contact, close enough to see it, to feel its heat on her face, but never to be welcomed into its circle. An embrace, a simple, heartfelt hug that was a treasure more precious and unattainable than gold. Her worldly possessions were contained in a single, faded canvas valise resting on the seat beside her. It held 2 spare dresses, neatly folded, her nursing implements wrapped in oilcloth, a worn Bible, and a small bar of lye soap. It was a meager collection, the sum total of a life lived on the periphery. But tucked inside the pocket of her coat, its crisp edges a constant reassurance against her ribs, was the item that mattered most to Letter. The paper was thick, the handwriting a man's, decisive and black. It had come from a place she'd only ever seen on a map, a tiny dot named Elk Hollow. The letter was not personal. It was a formal inquiry, sent by a man named Elias Vance, the town elder. He wrote that Elk Hollow was in need of a nurse. Their last doctor had moved on to seek his fortune in the silver mines 2 years prior, and the women of the town, while capable, were overwhelmed. They needed someone with formal training, someone who understood poultices and fevers, broken bones and childbirth. The letter was terse, practical. It promised a small stipend and lodging. It did not ask about her past, her family, or her marital status. It asked only if she was willing. For Nora, that was everything. A place that needed her skills, not her history, a place that might not yet have heard the whispers that had followed her through the streets of Kansas. It was a fragile, flickering hope, as delicate as a candle flame in a draft. But it was all she had. She had spent her last dollars on the train ticket, a one-way passage into the unknown. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track had been a lullaby for 3 days, a sound of forward motion, of escape. But now, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of pale orange and lavender, a new anxiety began to prickle at the edges of her calm. The letter had stated someone would be there to meet her, a Mr. Maggs, who ran the local boarding house where a room had been arranged. What if he wasn't there? What if the letter had been a mistake? A cruel joke? The old fears, the familiar companions of her solitude, began to stir. The train's whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that echoed off the unseen mountains and seemed to be swallowed by the immense silence. The rhythm of the wheels slowed, the rhythmic clatter becoming a labored, grinding squeal. Nora's heart began to beat a little faster. She pulled her gloves on tighter, her breath misting in the frigid air of the car. She stood, her legs stiff from sitting, and reached for her valise. The handle was cold and hard against her palm. With a final, great sigh of steam and a jolt that rattled the windows in their frames, the train came to a stop. This was it, Elk Hollow. Nora made her way to the end of the car, her boots sounding unnaturally loud on the wooden floor. The conductor, a man with a face like a worn leather map, simply nodded as he opened the door, not offering a hand, his expression impassive. She paused on the top step, her eyes scanning the platform. It was hardly a platform at all, just a raised stretch of wooden planks, already disappearing under a fresh dusting of snow. A single lantern hung from a post, casting a weak yellow circle of light against the encroaching twilight. The light illuminated the swirling dance of snowflakes, thick and heavy, falling from a sky the color of slate. Beyond the lantern's glow, there was only darkness and the faint outline of a few squat buildings. There was no one there. No Mr. Maggs, no welcoming committee, no one at all. Just the snow, the biting wind that whipped her skirts around her ankles, and the profound, absolute silence of the wilderness. She stepped down from the train, her boots sinking into a few inches of powder. The cold was shocking now, a physical blow that stole her breath. She stood there, a lone figure in the falling snow, clutching her valise, watching as the conductor signaled to the engineer, with another hiss of steam and the groan of metal. The train began to move, pulling away from the lonely platform, its lighted windows sliding past her like a series of fleeting, warm portraits of a world to which she did not belong. She watched until the last red light of the caboose had vanished into the swirling snow and the darkness. The sound of its passing faded, leaving behind a quiet so deep it seemed to have a weight, a pressure that pressed in on her from all sides. The only sound now was the whisper of the wind through the pines and the soft, steady shushing of the falling snow. Nora Lee stood alone, the letter in her pocket suddenly feeling as thin and cold as the air around her. She had traveled 1,000 miles to find a place without judgment, a place to begin again. But as the winter night settled over Elk Hollow, she was met not with a welcome, but with the same familiar companion she had tried so desperately to leave behind, a vast and empty silence. For a long time, Nora did not move. The cold was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that settled on her shoulders, and the silence was a vast, ringing emptiness in her ears. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to rise in her throat. It was a familiar sensation, the prelude to despair. But then another, deeper instinct took over, the stubborn, quiet resilience of a plant growing in poor soil. She had not come this far to freeze to death on a deserted platform. Hoisting the valise, its weight a grounding reality, she turned toward the faint, scattered lights of the town. The main path, if there ever was one, was completely obscured by the snow. Every step was a battle. The snow was deeper than it looked, sometimes coming up over the tops of her worn leather boots, and the wind was a relentless adversary, finding every small gap in her coat and slicing through to her skin. It whipped loose strands of her brown hair across her face, stinging her cheeks until they were numb. The town of Elk Hollow revealed itself slowly, reluctantly. It was not a town of grand facades or welcoming avenues. The buildings were dark, hulking shapes huddled together for warmth against the immense wilderness that surrounded them. Most windows were dark, their occupants already surrendered to the night. A single, wider path, churned to a muddy slush by wagon wheels and horses before the fresh snow had fallen, served as the main street. On one side stood a saloon, from which a sliver of yellow light and the faint, tinny sound of a piano escaped. On the other was a dark-fronted general store and a smithy, its great maw cold and silent. It was a place built for necessity, not for comfort. Her hope, which had flickered so brightly on the train, was now a tiny, guttering ember. The letter from Mr. Vance had mentioned the boarding house was on the north end of town, near the horse ranch. Clinging to that one piece of information, she trudged onward, leaving the meager life of the main street behind. The path became less defined. The buildings grew sparse, and the smell of pine and cold earth grew stronger, mingling with another, more pungent scent, that of horses, hay, and manure. Finally, she saw it. Set back from the path, at the very edge of the town's reach, was a 2-story wooden structure, a crude, swinging sign, creaking mournfully in the wind. Read simply, Mag's Rooms. It was less a boarding house and more a stubborn outpost against the wilderness. A long, low-fenced paddock stretched out behind it, and the dark shapes of several horses were visible, their backs dusted with snow, their heads bowed against the wind. Smoke curled thinly from a stone chimney, a fragile promise of warmth within. Nora climbed the 3 rickety steps to the porch, her boots thudding heavily on the wood. She set down her valise and, with a gloved hand that trembled from cold and apprehension, knocked on the thick wooden door. The sound was swallowed by the wind. She waited. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, the rap of her knuckles sharp and desperate. A long moment passed, long enough for doubt to creep back in. Then, she heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across a wooden floor, followed by the grating of a bolt being drawn. The door opened a few inches, and a sliver of warm, lamp-lit air spilled out, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and old wool. A face appeared in the crack, a man's face, deeply lined and shadowed, with a thick, graying beard and eyes that peered out from under bushy brows with undisguised suspicion. "What do you want?" The voice was a low growl, rough as gravel. I'm Nora Lee," she said, her own voice sounding thin against the wind. "I believe a room was arranged for me. A letter from Mr. Vance." The man grunted. The sound was non-committal, neither a welcome nor a dismissal. He opened the door wider, revealing his full form. He was shorter than she expected, but built like a barrel, with broad, stooped shoulders. He leaned heavily on a thick wooden cane, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. This had to be Mr. Mags. Thought the snow'd keep you. He said it wasn't an apology. It was a simple statement of fact. He stepped back, a clear, if ungracious, invitation to enter. Nora quickly grabbed her valise and stepped over the threshold, into the relative warmth of the house. "Mr." Mags bolted the door behind her, the sound loud and final in the quiet room. The main room was Spartan. A long wooden table with several mismatched chairs sat in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within, providing the room's only real warmth and light. The air was still and close. "Room's upstairs, second on the right," Mags said, not looking at her. He limped over to the hearth and jabbed at the logs with a poker, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Rules are simple. I ain't your mother. Breakfast is at sunrise. Supper is at sundown. You miss it. You go hungry. Cost is $4 a week. Stipend from the town council covers it. Don't cause trouble." He didn't ask where she was from. He didn't ask why she'd come. He didn't ask why no one had met her at the station. His lack of curiosity was the greatest kindness he could have offered. For the first time in hours, Nora felt a knot of tension in her shoulders begin to loosen. "Thank you, Mr. Mags," she said quietly. He just grunted again in response. "Lamp and kindling are in the room. Water's in the pitcher. Don't waste either." She nodded, took her valise, and made her way to the narrow staircase. The wood groaned under her weight. Her room was just as he'd described. It was small and cold, containing only a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a small wooden stand with a basin and pitcher, and a single straight-backed chair. A small window looked out into the black, swirling snow. It was stark, but it was clean, and, most importantly, it was hers. Exhaustion fell over her like a physical weight. She managed to light the small oil lamp, its flickering flame pushing back the shadows, before sitting on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw and rustled beneath her. She was too tired to eat, too tired to even unpack. She simply removed her wet boots and her coat and slipped under the heavy quilt, fully dressed. The sheets were cold and smelled faintly of wood smoke. Sleep came quickly, a deep, dreamless plunge into oblivion. Sometime later, in the dead of night, she was pulled from that sleep by a sound. At first, it was just a dull, rhythmic thudding, a sound that penetrated the thick walls of the house and the fog of her sleep. Hoofbeats. A single horse, moving at a steady, unhurried pace through the deep snow. The sound grew louder, stopping just outside. Nora lay perfectly still, her eyes wide open in the darkness, listening. She heard the soft snort of the horse, the creak of leather as a rider dismounted. Heavy footsteps crunched on the porch, followed by a low, guttural muttering a man's voice, cursing the cold. The front door opened and closed, the sound muffled by the floorboards. She heard the heavy tread of his boots in the common room below, the sound of Mr. Mags's dragging limp, and then the low murmur of two male voices. The words were indistinct, rough and clipped, but the tone was familiar, practical. This was not a social call. After a few minutes, she heard the footsteps again and the front door closed. The hoofbeats resumed, fading slowly back into the silent, snowy night. Nora didn't fall back to sleep for a long time. The presence of the late-night visitor left a strange disquiet in the air. This was a hard place. She knew. A place where men came and went at all hours. Their business their own. She was an outsider here, a stranger, and it was best to remain unseen and unheard. The next morning, she awoke to a gray, muted light filtering through the window. The snow had stopped. She washed her face with the icy water from the pitcher, the shock of it chasing away the last vestiges of sleep, and braided her hair neatly, putting on a clean, practical dress of dark gray wool. She prepared to face her first day. The common room was warmer than the night before. A fire blazed in the hearth, and the smell of strong coffee and frying bacon hung in the air. Mr. Mags was seated at the head of the table, a tin plate of food in front of him, his cane leaning against his chair. He glanced up as she descended the stairs, gave a slight nod toward the stove where a coffee pot was warming, and then returned his attention to his meal. Nora poured herself a mug of the black, bitter coffee and was just about to sit at the far end of the table when the front door opened, bringing with it a blast of frigid air. The man who entered seemed to fill the entire doorway. He was tall, far taller than Mr. Maggs, with shoulders that strained the seams of his thick, sheepskin-lined coat. He took off his hat, knocking a dusting of snow from its brim, and ran a hand through his dark, unruly hair. And then he turned his head, and Nora saw his face. It was a face carved from the harsh landscape outside. Strong jaw, weathered skin, a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line, but it was the scar that drew her eye. A thin, silvery line that started at his right temple, cut down across the hard plane of his cheekbone, and disappeared into his stubble-shadowed jaw. It was an old wound, long since healed, but it gave his face a dangerous, lopsided intensity. His eyes, when they swept the room, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a flat, cold gray. They were eyes that missed nothing and gave away even less. This was the man from the night before. She knew it instantly. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his worn leather chaps whispering with each step. "Calderon, Mr." Maggs grunted by way of greeting. The cowboy, Calderon, gave a short, sharp nod in return. He moved to the stove and poured himself a mug of coffee, his movements economical and sure. He didn't speak. As he turned, his gaze fell on Nora. She braced herself instinctively. She knew this look. It was the moment of assessment, the moment she became something other than a person. In Kansas, it would have been followed by a flicker of pity, or morbid curiosity, or outright fear. The eyes of the fearful would slide away, as if her presence were a blight. The pious would offer a look of sorrowful condescension. The cruel would stare, their gaze lingering on her as if she were a curious specimen in a jar. But this man's gaze was different. His cold, gray eyes met hers across the room, and they simply held. There was no fear in them, no pity, no revulsion. There was a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, at seeing a new face, but it was followed by a flat, neutral appraisal. He looked at her the way a man might look at an unfamiliar horse, assessing its lines, its temperament, its strength, without sentiment or judgment. He took in her plain dress, her tidy hair, her weary face, and the hands resting in her lap. His eyes lingered on her for a beat longer than was polite, a direct, unnerving stillness. Then he gave a barely perceptible nod, as if he had seen what he needed to see, and turned his attention back to Mr. Maggs. The moment was over in seconds, but it left Nora feeling strangely breathless. He hadn't recoiled. He hadn't shied away. He was the first person in years who had looked at her and seen nothing more than a woman sitting at a table. "That mare still favoring her foreleg," Calderon said, his voice a low baritone, "as rough as unplaned wood." "Figured," Maggs replied, sopping up egg yolk with a piece of bread. "Liniment do any good?" "Some. She needs rest." Their conversation was clipped, functional, stripped of all unnecessary words. Calderon leaned against the wall near the fireplace, sipping his coffee, his presence a powerful, silent weight in the small room. He was, Nora learned from their sparse exchange, the man who managed the horses for the town livery, stabling some of them here at Maggs's ranch. He was Reese Calderon, and in a world that had always looked at her with fear, he was the only one who had looked at her and seemed entirely unafraid. A quiet rhythm began to settle over Nora's life, as stark and steady as the winter landscape. Her days were marked by the rising and setting of the sun, by the simple, repetitive tasks that kept the boarding house running. She kept the fire fed, helped Mr. Mags with the cooking, and mended linens by the low light of the afternoon. It was a Spartan existence, but in its simplicity, there was a kind of peace. The house, with its creaking floors and drafty windows, became her sanctuary. Her arrangement with Mr. Mags was never spoken of, but it formed itself out of necessity. A few days after her arrival, she saw him by the fire, his jaw tight with a pain he was trying to hide, struggling to change the dressing on his bad leg. The old wound, a relic of whatever war had claimed his mobility, was inflamed and angry-looking. She had approached quietly, her nursing kit in hand. "Let me," she had said, her voice soft but firm. He'd looked up, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and pride. "I can manage." "I know," she'd answered, kneeling beside his chair without waiting for permission. "But it will heal better if it's cleaned properly. That's a deep-set injury. It needs care." He watched her for a long moment, his gruff exterior warring with the exhaustion of his constant pain. He finally gave a short, sharp grunt and thrust his leg forward, a gesture of reluctant surrender. Her hands were gentle and efficient as she cleaned the wound, applied a soothing salve of her own making, and wrapped it in clean linen. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. From that day on, she tended to his leg every morning. He never thanked her, but when she went into town for supplies, he would press a few coins into her hand without a word. Her nursing had bought her keep. It was these trips into the heart of Elk Hollow that burst the fragile bubble of her solitude. The town was a living, breathing thing, and like any living thing, it was wary of outsiders. Her first visit to the general store had been a study in veiled curiosity. The proprietor's wife, a plump, bustling woman named Martha Gable, had been the first to probe. "You'll be the new nurse, then?" she'd asked, her eyes sharp as she weighed a sack of flour. "Come all the way from Kansas, I hear." Nora had simply nodded, offering a polite but distant smile. "Yes, ma'am." "Kansas," Mrs. Gable had repeated, as if the word itself held a special significance. "Heard they had a bad spell of the lung fever back that way." And so it began. The news of her past, of her specific, grim work, must have traveled on the same wind that carried the snow. It passed from one person to another, a whispered contagion. Nora felt the change almost immediately. It was not a wall of open hostility, but something more insidious, a slow, creeping chill that mirrored the winter outside. It was in the glances that slid away the moment she met them. It was in the way a group of men talking outside the smithy would fall silent as she approached, their eyes following her until she passed. It was in the way women would gather their children a little closer, their hands resting protectively on small shoulders, as if Nora herself were a walking affliction. She heard the whispers once. A fragment of conversation caught as she rounded the corner of the feed store. "And the one who tended the consumptives carries a taint. My ma always said, you can't touch that kind of sickness and not have it cling to you." Mercy. Look at her. Who in their right mind would ever want to touch her? The words were not meant for her ears, but they found their mark, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. A hot flush of shame and anger rose in her cheeks, but she pushed it down, burying it deep. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and kept walking. She did not react. She had built a fortress around her heart with the bricks of 1,000 such insults. The whispers of Elk Hollow were no different from the whispers of Kansas. They could not touch the part of her that had already learned to survive in isolation. Her only respite from the town's subtle shunning was at the boarding house. Mr. Mags remained as surly and uncommunicative as ever, but his gruffness was a comfort. He judged people on their utility, not their history. She was useful to him, so he tolerated her. It was a simple, honest transaction. And then there was Reese Calderon. He was an infrequent but recurring presence. He would appear at dawn or dusk, a tall, silent figure bringing with him the scent of horse and cold leather. He and Mags would speak in their clipped, laconic way about livestock, feed, and the weather. He never spoke directly to Nora, but she always felt his eyes on her. His gaze was still as unnervingly direct and neutral as it had been on that first morning. He watched her as she moved about the common room, his expression unreadable. He did not smile, but more importantly, he did not recoil. He simply watched. And, for reasons she could not explain, his quiet observation felt less like judgment and more like a simple acknowledgement of her existence. One afternoon, as a heavy snow began to fall again, the front door opened and Calderon stepped inside, shaking the wet flakes from his coat. He was not moving with his usual easy stride. There was a stiffness in his posture, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of pain. "Mags," he said, his voice a low rumble. The old soldier looked up from the harness he was mending. "What is it?" "Pulled something in my back, up high. An old trouble spot." Reese moved toward the fire, arching his back in a way that was clearly painful. "Thought you might have some of that horse liniment." Mags grunted, gesturing with his thumb toward Nora. "Ask her. She's the one with the potions and salves." Reese Calderon turned his head, and his gray eyes settled on Nora. There was a flicker of hesitation in them now, not of fear, but of a proud man's reluctance to show weakness or ask for help. Nora stood, her hands smoothing the front of her apron in a nervous gesture. "I have a salve that might help," she said, her voice quiet. "It's for muscle strain." He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Nora's heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. She expected him to refuse, to shake his head and retreat back into his stoic self-reliance. "All right," he said at last. The word clipped. "Here," she said, gesturing to a chair near the firelight. "By the hearth. I'll need to see it." He moved to the chair and sat, his back to her. He pulled his rough wool shirt over his head, his movement stiff. "Mister." Mags watched them from his seat, his expression impassive. In the flickering firelight, Nora saw that Reese Calderon's back was a landscape of old wounds, a patchwork of faded scars, white and silver against his tanned skin, told stories of a hard-lived life. But it was the skin across his left shoulder blade that made her draw in a soft breath. It was a terrible, sprawling burn. The flesh puckered and twisted into a permanent, glossy sheen. It was an injury that must have caused an agony she could scarcely imagine. The current source of his pain seemed to be a knot of angry, swollen muscle just beside it. She went to her room and returned with a small clay pot and a clean linen cloth. Her hands were steady as she opened the pot, the scent of wintergreen and arnica filling the air. She dipped her fingers into the cool, thick salve. "This might be cold," she warned softly. He gave a short nod, his shoulders tense. Her touch, when it came, was professional and sure. She expected him to flinch from the cold of the salve, from the unexpected touch of a stranger. From her, men, in her experience, were often more skittish than frightened animals. But Reese Calderon did not move. He sat as still as a stone carving, his muscles rigid beneath her fingers. She worked the salve into the tight, knotted muscle, her touch gentle but firm, breaking down the tension with practiced skill. The world seemed to shrink to the space between her hands and his skin. The whispers of the town, the averted eyes, the years of feeling untouchable, it all fell away. In this moment, she was not a pariah. She was a nurse. He was not a fearsome cowboy. He was a man in pain. It was the simplest, most honest interaction she had known in years. She worked in silence, her breathing even, her focus complete. He remained utterly still, not a single flinch or jerk to betray any discomfort. He accepted her touch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When she was finished, she gently wiped the excess salve away with the cloth. "It should feel better in an hour or so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The heat from the fire will help it soak in." She moved away, putting the lid back on her pot, her hands trembling slightly now that the task was done. He sat for a moment longer before reaching for his shirt. As he pulled it on, he turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes shadowed and intense in the firelight. The silence returned, heavy with unspoken things. It was Nora who broke it. The question came from a place of deep, weary hurt. A question she had wanted to ask 100 people but never dared. "Aren't you afraid of me?" The words were so quiet. She wasn't sure he had heard them over the wind, but he stilled, his hands pausing on the buttons of his shirt. He did not answer immediately. He finished buttoning the shirt, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he stood up and turned to face her fully. He looked at her, his gaze direct, and for the first time she saw something beyond the coldness in his eyes. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a profound and weary understanding. The look of a man who had made his own peace with pain. "I've been half burned alive," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "What's left to be afraid of?" His words hung in the air between them long after he had gone, a strange and unsettling comfort. What's left to be afraid of? Nora found herself replaying the sentence in the quiet moments of the following days. It wasn't a reassurance, not in the way other people offered empty platitudes. It was a statement of fact, a glimpse into the harsh, fire-forged world of Reese Calderon, and in its stark honesty, it made her feel, for the first time, not entirely alone in her own scarred existence. Life at the boarding house continued its quiet, unvaried pace. An unspoken understanding now existed between her and Calderon. He still rarely spoke to her, but the silence was different now. It was less the silence of avoidance and more the quiet of shared territory, of two solitary creatures acknowledging each other's presence without the need for noise. The change, when it came, arrived with the violence of a thunderstorm. It was late in the afternoon, the sky a bruised purple, threatening more snow. A frantic pounding of hooves thundered into the yard, followed by a man's desperate shouts. "Calderon Mags! For God's sake, somebody help me!" Nora rushed to the door, pulling it open just as Mr. Mags limped out from the barn. A local rancher, a man named Jedediah Stone, was half falling from his saddle, his face pale with panic. Behind him, his workhorse, a big roan mare, stood trembling, one foreleg bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. The bone, white and splintered, had torn through the skin, and dark blood dripped onto the clean snow. The mare's eyes were wide with terror and pain, and a low, guttural sound of agony rumbled in her chest. Reese appeared from the livery barn, his long strides eating up the ground. He took one look at the horse and his face hardened into a grim mask. He didn't need to examine the leg. The damage was obvious and catastrophic. "What happened?" Reese's voice was low and calm, a stark contrast to the rancher's panic. "Ice patch down by the creek," Stone stammered, wringing his hands. "She went down hard. Oh, Lord, Reese, she's my best puller. She's all I've got." The man's plea was for the horse's life, but his tone was one of utter hopelessness. "Mr. Mags hobbled closer, his expression grim. "That's a bad break. Jed, a real bad one. Nothing to be done for it." The unspoken words hung heavy in the frigid air. Get the rifle. In this world, sentiment was a luxury that few could afford. A horse with a broken leg was a liability, a mouth to feed with no purpose. The kindest, most practical solution was a single, well-aimed bullet. It was a brutal mercy Nora had seen administered before, a stark piece of frontier arithmetic that always made her stomach clench. Reese walked slowly around the trembling animal, his movements calm and deliberate, his low voice murmuring nonsense sounds meant to soothe. The mare watched him, her ears twitching, her breathing coming in ragged, painful snorts. Nora could see the debate in Reese's eyes. He was a practical man, and everything in him, every piece of hard-won experience, screamed that this horse's life was over. He gave Jedediah Stone a short, hard look. "Go inside. Mags, get him a drink." It was a dismissal. He would handle the grim task alone. Stone, his face ashen, allowed Mags to lead him toward the house. Reese turned and walked toward the barn, his destination clear the rack where he kept his rifle. "Wait." The word was quiet, but it cut through the wind with surprising force. Reese stopped, turning to look at Nora. She had stepped off the porch and was walking toward the injured mare, her eyes fixed on the mangled leg. She had her nursing face on the calm, focused expression that pushed all emotion aside, leaving only a clinical resolve. "The break is clean," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She was close enough now to smell the copper tang of blood and the sharp scent of the animal's fear. "It's a compound fracture, but the bone hasn't shattered. It could be set." Reese stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Nora, this is a 1,000-pound animal, not a man in a bed. You can't set a leg like that. She'll never stand on it again. It won't heal right. It's a kindness to end it." "It's only a kindness if there's no other choice," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "In the hospitals back east, they were starting to use plaster casts. For traction, we could make a splint, a strong one. We could immobilize it, give it a chance." "A chance to what? To starve to death standing in a stall because she can't be worked, to live in constant pain?" His voice was rough, edged with a frustration that came from a deep well of pragmatism. He was not being cruel. He was being realistic. "A chance to heal," she insisted, taking another step closer. She looked from the horse's terrified eyes to his. "You said yourself you've been burned. You healed. Wounds can heal, even terrible ones, if they're given the chance. Please, let me try." He looked at her, at the fierce determination burning in her eyes, a fire that seemed to hold the winter cold at bay. He saw the woman who had tended his own painful wound without flinching. He saw a healer, not just a nurse. He was a man who understood broken things, who knew the value of what was worth mending and what was best left to the earth. Everything he knew about horses told him this was a fool's errand, a waste of time and a prolongation of suffering. But something in her certainty, in her refusal to accept the inevitable, made him pause. He looked back at the mare, who had quieted slightly under Nora's calm presence. He thought of the rifle, cold and heavy in his hands. Then he looked at Nora's hands, clean and capable, ready to work. He let out a long, slow breath, the vapor pluming in the air. "Get what you need," he said, his voice a low growl of resignation. "I'll get her into the barn." The next 6 hours were a descent into a world of sweat, blood, and strained silence. The barn was a cavern of flickering shadows, lit by 2 lanterns that cast long, dancing silhouettes against the rough-hewn walls. The air grew thick with the smells of hay, antiseptic, and the raw, metallic scent of the horse's pain. Reese was a master with the animal. He fashioned a sling from thick canvas straps and a block and tackle, hoisting the mare just enough to take the weight off her shattered leg. He spoke to her constantly, his voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to be the only thing anchoring the terrified animal to the earth. Nora worked with a feverish, focused intensity. She cleaned the wound with carbolic acid and water, her hands moving with a sureness that belied the tremor she felt inside. The sight of the raw, exposed bone would have turned most people's stomachs, but to her, it was simply a problem to be solved, a piece of the body that was out of place and needed to be put right. The hardest part was setting the bone. It required Reese's brute strength and her precise direction. "I need you to pull, straight and steady," she instructed, her voice low and calm. "When I tell you, I'm going to guide the bone back into place. It will hurt her. Be ready." He nodded, his jaw tight. He took hold of the hoof, his powerful hands gentle but firm. "Now," she said softly. He pulled. The mare screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure agony that echoed in the rafters. A shudder ran through the massive body, and for a terrifying moment, Nora thought the horse would thrash itself to death, but Rhys held firm, his muscles straining, his voice a constant, soothing rumble in the animal's ear. Nora, her own hands slick with blood, worked quickly, her fingers probing, guiding the splintered ends of the bone until, with a sickening, grating crunch, they slipped back into alignment. For a moment, they both froze, breathing heavily in the sudden silence. The mare let out a long, shuddering sigh, her body trembling violently. But she was still. The worst was over. They worked without speaking for the next few hours. A silent, efficient team. Nora directed. Rhys obeyed. They found old wooden slats from a broken crate and padded them with torn strips of wool blankets. He held the heavy splint in place while she wrapped it, pulling the canvas strips as tight as she could, her arms aching with the effort. They moved around each other in the cramped space as if they had been working together their whole lives. It was an intimacy born not of words, but of shared, desperate labor. She saw the sweat beading on his temples, the strain in the cords of his neck. He saw the fierce concentration that narrowed her eyes, the smudge of blood on her cheek, the unyielding strength in her slender frame. Finally, it was done. The leg was set, splinted, and wrapped. The mare stood quietly in the sling, her head hanging low, exhausted but alive. The bleeding had stopped. Nora sagged against a wooden post, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Every muscle in her body ached. She was covered in grime, her dress stained with blood, her hands raw. Rhys stood by the horse's head, one hand resting on its neck, his breathing still heavy. In the quiet of the barn, under the soft, golden light of the lanterns, he looked at her. The look was different from any he had given her before. The coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something deeper. It was respect. It was awe. He was looking at her not as the town's strange, untouchable nurse, but as an equal, a partner in a hard-won battle. He had seen her stare down the inevitable and, through sheer force of will, bend it to her purpose. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft breathing of the horse and the sigh of the wind outside the barn doors. "She'll need water," Nora finally said, her voice hoarse. "And a mash, if she'll take it." "I'll see to it," he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You should go in, get some rest." She nodded, too tired to argue. The walk back to the house was through the deep, pre-dawn cold. The world was utterly still, blanketed in a fresh layer of snow that muffled all sound. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a pale, gray promise of a new day. They walked a few feet apart, their boots crunching in the snow, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with the echo of their shared ordeal. As they reached the porch steps of the boarding house, Nora stopped. She looked up at the vast, star-flecked sky, then turned to him in the faint, gray light. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his scar a pale line against his weary skin. "No one ever let me touch anything," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind. The confession was pulled from a deep, lonely place inside her. Not a person, not an animal. They were always afraid I'd break it or taint it. Rhys looked at her, at the raw vulnerability in her eyes. He didn't offer words of comfort. Words were not his tools. Instead, he moved with the same quiet deliberation he'd shown all night. He shrugged out of his heavy, sheepskin-lined coat. The warmth of his body still clung to it as he stepped forward and wrapped it around her shoulders. It enveloped her, a heavy, comforting weight that smelled of leather, wood smoke, and him. She looked up at him, surprised. His cold, gray eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw the simple, irrefutable truth of the night's work. "I let you," he said. The coat was a tangible presence, a heavy, constant reminder of the night in the barn. It lay folded at the foot of her bed, and Nora found herself touching it at odd moments during the day. The rough sheepskin and worn leather a connection to the man who had placed it around her shoulders. Reese had not asked for it back, and she had not offered to return it. It was an unspoken loan, a piece of him left in her care. In the days that followed their shared vigil over the injured mare, the atmosphere in the boarding house settled into a new kind of quiet. The silence between Nora and Reese was no longer an empty space, but a vessel holding the memory of their work. They were two people who had stood together at the precipice of a small, desperate life and refused to let it fall. It had forged something between them, a bond made not of words but of blood, sweat, and a shared, stubborn will. The mare, whom Nora had named Patience, was surviving. Her fever had broken, and she was beginning to put the smallest amount of trust on her splinted leg. Nora spent hours in the barn with her, changing her dressings, speaking to her in a low, soft voice. Reese would often be there, working silently, mending tack or grooming another horse. He never interfered with her care of the mare, but she would feel his eyes on her, his gaze watchful and steady. One evening, nearly a week after the incident, Mr. Maggs had gone into town for a meeting of the council, leaving the house unusually still. Nora was in the common room, reading her Bible by the fading light, when Reese came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots. She expected him to simply warm himself by the fire and retreat to his own quarters, as was his custom. Instead, he went to the hearth where a pot of stew, left by Maggs, was simmering over the embers. He took down 2 tin bowls from the mantelpiece. He ladled the thick, savory stew into one, then hesitated for a moment before filling the second. He carried both bowls to the long wooden table and set them down. He placed a wooden spoon beside each. Then he looked at her. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. The invitation was in the simple, deliberate act of setting a place for her. Nora's heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. A meal, a shared meal. It was such a simple, ordinary thing. Yet for her, it felt momentous, terrifying. In Kansas, she had always taken her meals alone in her small room, a tray left outside her door. The thought of eating in the presence of another person, of being observed in such a mundane, vulnerable act, sent a tremor of anxiety through her. The last time she had sat at a table and shared food with someone who was not a patient had been so long ago she could not conjure the memory. She closed her Bible and rose slowly from her chair. He was already seated, his back to the fire, his large frame casting a long shadow across the room. She walked to the table and slid onto the bench opposite him, keeping her eyes down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The space between them felt as wide and vast as the winter prairie. The stew was rich with the taste of venison and root vegetables, and the steam rising from the bowl was a small cloud of warmth in the chilly room. For a long time, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind against the window panes, and the quiet clink of Reese's spoon against his bowl. Nora could not bring herself to eat. She simply stared at the food, her stomach a tight knot of nerves. She was intensely aware of him. She could feel the heat radiating from the fireplace behind him, could see the way the lamplight caught the silver line of the scar on his temple. He ate slowly, his movements measured and unhurried. He did not seem to notice her stillness. He did not press her to eat or try to fill the silence with clumsy conversation. He simply granted her the dignity of the quiet, allowing her to find her own way into the moment. Finally, summoning all her courage, she picked up her spoon. It felt foreign in her hand, a clumsy tool she had forgotten how to wield. As she dipped it into the stew and raised it to her lips, she saw that her hand was trembling, a fine, almost imperceptible tremor. A hot flush of shame washed over her. She was certain he would see it, that he would think her weak or foolish. She quickly lowered the spoon, her knuckles white as she gripped it. But Reese gave no sign that he had noticed. He continued to eat his own meal, his gaze fixed on his bowl. His quiet refusal to acknowledge her tremor was a profound act of grace. He was allowing her to keep her composure, to retain her pride. Slowly, cautiously. She tried again. This time, her hand was a little steadier. She took a small spoonful of the stew. The warmth of it spread through her, a welcome heat that seemed to touch a place deep inside her that had been cold for a very long time. They finished their meal in that same companionable silence. When they were done, Rhys took their empty bowls and set them on the hearth to be washed in the morning. He added another log to the fire, sending a cascade of bright orange sparks up the chimney. The worn armchair, the one Mags favored, sat empty beside the fire. Rhys gestured toward it with a slight inclination of his head. "Take the warm seat," he said. It was the first time he had spoken since he'd entered the room. Nora moved to the chair, her limbs stiff. It was still warm from the old soldier's body. She sank into it, the heat a welcome comfort. Rhys did not sit beside her. Instead, he leaned against the mantelpiece. One booted foot crossed over the other, maintaining a careful, respectful distance. He was close enough for her to feel his presence, but far enough that she did not feel crowded or threatened. The firelight played across his weathered face, softening its hard lines. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Nora watched him, her earlier anxiety slowly melting away, replaced by a quiet sense of wonder. She was here, sitting by a fire, sharing a room with a man who did not fear her, who had trusted her, who had invited her to his table. It was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. She thought of the years in Kansas, of the endless solitude, of the feeling of being encased in glass, visible to all but untouchable. She had grown so accustomed to her isolation that she had begun to believe it was an essential part of her, a second skin she could never shed. But now, sitting in the quiet warmth of this room, a different possibility began to flicker within her, as fragile and tentative as a new flame. A long time passed. The log on the fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind had died down, and a profound stillness had settled over the world. It was in that deep, peaceful quiet that Nora found the courage to speak the truth that had defined her entire existence. She turned her head to look at him, her voice barely a whisper, a sound so soft it was almost part of the silence itself. "I've never," she began, her voice faltering. She took a breath and tried again. "I've never been held, not even once." The confession lay between them, stark and vulnerable. It was the deepest, most painful secret of her heart, the source of an ache so profound she had never dared give it a name. She expected him to be shocked, to offer a clumsy word of pity, or worse, to fall into an embarrassed silence. Rhys did none of those things. He did not move from his place by the mantel. He simply turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers in the firelight. There was no pity in his gaze, only a deep, solemn stillness, as if he were taking the full weight of her words and holding them with care. He seemed to understand that her confession was not a plea, but a statement of a long and barren history. He was silent for a long moment. And in that silence, she felt not judgment, but a quiet, patient understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, soft rumble, as gentle as she had ever heard it. "I'll start slow," he said. The words were a promise, not of passion, not of romance, but of something far more precious to her patience. It was an acknowledgement of her fear and a vow to respect it. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She simply held his gaze, a silent, grateful acknowledgement passing between them. He stayed there for a few minutes more, then pushed himself away from the mantel. It was time to go. Nora instinctively clutched the arms of the chair, a sudden, foolish pang of disappointment hitting her. He walked past her chair on his way to the staircase. As he did, he paused, She saw his hand lift slightly, as if he might reach out to touch her shoulder, but he stopped himself. He let his hand fall back to his side. The decision to not touch her was as deliberate and meaningful as any embrace could have been. He was already keeping his promise. He looked down and saw his coat, which she had brought in from the barn and draped over the back of a nearby chair. He picked it up, not to take it, but to unfold it, gently, without a word. He draped it over her shoulders again, as he had done in the cold yard. The heavy, warm weight settled around her, a familiar comfort. Then he turned and walked up the stairs, his footsteps receding into the quiet of the house. Nora sat alone by the dying fire, wrapped in the warmth of his coat, the echo of his promise, a gentle, persistent glow inside her. I'll start slow. For the first time in her life, a beginning felt possible. His promise. I'll start slow, echoed not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of the days that followed. It was in the way he started leaving a second cup of coffee on the hearth in the mornings, a silent offering that waited for her to wake. It was in the way he cleared a path for her through the snow to the barn, his long strides packing the powder down so her smaller boots wouldn't sink. These were small, practical acts, the only language of caring he seemed to know. And for Nora, they were more meaningful than a dozen flowery speeches. The world was beginning to thaw. The relentless snows of winter gave way to the wet, heavy snows of early spring. The sun held a little more warmth each day, and the tight, frozen grip on the land began to loosen. With the coming of the thaw, the need for travel grew. Families on distant homesteads would need supplies, and the trails, now thick with mud and melting ice, were treacherous. Nora realized the limits of her own 2 feet when word came that a homesteader's wife 5 miles up the valley was expecting her first child. I should go, Nora had said to Mr. Maggs. She might need help. 5 miles is a long walk in this mud, the old man had grunted. You'd be half drowned by the time you got there. Reese was there, cleaning a bridle by the fire. He had listened to the exchange without looking up. She needs a horse, he said, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact. He finally raised his eyes and looked at Nora. I'll teach you. And so the lessons began. Her teacher was as patient and unyielding as the mountains themselves. The horse he chose for her was a calm, steady buckskin gelding named Dust Devil, a name that seemed far too boisterous for the animal's placid nature. To Nora, however, standing beside it, the horse was a terrifying mountain of muscle and bone. It was one thing to tend to an animal's wounds when it was immobilized. It was another thing entirely to willingly climb onto its back and cede control. Her first attempt to mount was a clumsy, graceless affair that ended with her sliding right off the other side, landing in a heap in the soft mud of the paddock. She lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of her cheek cold and wet, a hot flush of humiliation creeping up her neck. She expected Reese to laugh, or at least to show some sign of exasperation. Instead, he just stood there, holding the horse's reins, his expression unreadable. You're thinking too much, he said, his voice even. It's like a dance. You have to feel the rhythm, not just count the steps. Try again. She did, and again. Her body ached with the effort, her muscles screaming in protest at this new and unnatural posture. She fell again, this time jarring her shoulder. Pain shot through her, sharp and bright, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unfamiliar surge of defiance. She would not be beaten by this. She had faced down death in a dozen sick rooms. She would not be defeated by a horse and a patch of mud. Gritting her teeth, she pulled herself up and, with Reese giving her a steadying hand on her elbow, she swung herself into the saddle, and this time, she stayed put. The look on his face wasn't one of praise, but of a quiet, grudging respect, which felt infinitely more valuable. The days that followed were a blur of aching muscles, patient instruction, and small victories. Heels down, Lee, he would say. calling her by her surname in his gruff, instructor's tone. "You're not a sack of potatoes. Sit straight. Feel the horse move under you." He taught her how to hold the reins, not with a panicked iron grip, but with a light, confident touch. He taught her how to use the pressure of her legs to guide the animal, to become a part of its movement rather than a passenger fighting against it. He started by leading her in slow circles around the paddock, his long strides matching the horse's pace. Then, one day, he let go of the lead rope. "He's yours," he said. "Take him." Nora's heart leaped into her throat, but she remembered his words. "Heels down. Sit straight. Look where you're going." She gently squeezed her legs, and Dust Devil moved forward in a steady walk. She was doing it. She was riding. They moved out of the paddock and onto the open land behind the ranch. The wind, crisp and cold with the last bite of winter, whipped her hair back from her face and filled her lungs. For the first time, she saw the valley not as a place of confinement, but as a vast, open space of breathtaking beauty. The snow was receding in patches, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The mountains, their peaks still white, loomed against a brilliant blue sky. Reese rode beside her on his own powerful bay, a silent, watchful presence. He pushed her, urging her from a walk to a trot, the jarring rhythm a new challenge that she slowly, painstakingly mastered. Then, one afternoon, as they rode across a wide, flat meadow, he looked over at her. "Ready?" he asked. She didn't know what she was ready for, but she saw a rare, faint glimmer of a challenge in his eyes. She nodded. "Then hold on," he said. He gave a low whistle, and his own horse broke into a smooth, powerful canter. On instinct, Dust Devil followed, surging forward. The sudden burst of speed stole Nora's breath. The steady trot erupted into a rocking, fluid motion, a feeling of pure, untethered flight. All of Reese's lessons, the straight back, the low heels, the light hands snapped into place, and she moved with the horse, a single, unified being. The wind roared in her ears. The ground flew by in a blur of brown and white. A feeling of exhilarating, terrifying joy surged through her, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar that it overwhelmed her. And a sound bubbled up from deep within her chest, a sound she had not made in years. A laugh. It wasn't a quiet, polite laugh. It was a loud, uninhibited, breathless peal of pure delight. It was the sound of a cage door, rusted shut for years, suddenly bursting open. She laughed until her sides ached, until tears streamed from her eyes and were whipped away by the wind. Reese slowed his horse, turning in his saddle to watch her. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his own mouth as he saw her face, flushed and alive, transformed by a joy he had never seen there before. The sound of her laughter was a wilder, more beautiful thing than the cry of any hawk or the rush of any river. Her newfound freedom changed how she moved through the world. The people of Elk Hollow began to see a different Nora Lee. They saw her riding through town on the buckskin gelding, her back straight, her chin held high. They heard the stories. Of course, Jedediah Stone, his prize mare now slowly recovering in his own barn, had told everyone who would listen about the nurse who had refused to let his horse die. They saw the grit in her when they'd watched her fall and get back up in the paddock. They saw her riding out with Reese Calderon, a man whose judgment they trusted implicitly. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a cautious, curious respect. The woman who had once seemed a fragile specter of death now looked strong, capable, alive. One crisp afternoon, Nora was returning from the general store, a small sack of supplies in her arms, when she heard the frantic pounding of small feet on the boardwalk behind her. Ma'am, are you the nurse?" Nora turned. A small boy, no older than 7, with a smudged face and wide, terrified blue eyes, stood there, panting for breath. "Yes, I am," Nora said, her voice calm. "It's my mother," the boy cried, tears welling. "The stew pot, it tipped. She's burned. Please, you have to come." All the progress she had made, all her newfound confidence, vanished in that instant, replaced by a pure, sharpened instinct. She was no longer Nora Lee, the outcast, or Nora Lee, the apprentice rider. She was a nurse. "Show me," she said, her voice steady and sure. She dropped her supplies on the boardwalk and ran, her skirts flying as she followed the small boy down a muddy side street to a small, rough-hewn cabin at the edge of town. Inside, a young woman was slumped in a chair, cradling her arm, her face white with shock and pain. The front of her dress was soaked, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt wool and scalded skin. Nora took in the scene with a quick, professional glance. "My name is Nora," she said to the woman, her voice radiating a calm she did not feel. "I'm a nurse. Let me see." The woman, her eyes glazed with pain, hesitantly held out her arm, a large, angry red burn, already beginning to blister, covered her from wrist to elbow. Nora's heart ached with sympathy, but her hands were already moving. "Son, I need you to fetch me the cleanest water you have," she instructed the boy, who was hovering by the door, wringing his small hands. "And any clean cloths your mother keeps. Tear them into strips if you have to." While the boy scrambled to obey, Nora opened the medical bag she now carried with her everywhere. She worked quickly, her movements efficient and sure. She gently cut away the burnt fabric of the sleeve, her touch light as a feather. She cooled the angry skin with cloth soaked in water, and then coated the entire area with a thick, soothing salve of aloe and calendula. As she worked, she spoke to the woman in a low, steady murmur, the same tone Reese used to calm a frightened horse, a litany of soft reassurances that cut through the fog of pain. The woman watched her, her breathing slowly evening out as the salve began to cool the fire in her skin. She saw not the town pariah, the woman tainted by death, but a pair of sure, gentle hands that were bringing her relief. When the arm was cleaned and dressed, wrapped snugly in clean linen, Nora finally looked up. The young mother's eyes were filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude, not pain. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done. Thank you." She reached out with her good hand and took Nora's. The touch was not hesitant or fearful. It was a firm, warm grasp, a desperate, grateful connection. Nora looked down at their joined hands. This was what she had always been denied. This simple, human touch, offered freely, without reservation. And for the first time in Nora Leah's memory, the hand that held hers did not tremble. The thaw did not come gently to Elk Hollow. It arrived with a fury, a long, punishing siege of rain that turned the world to a uniform, dismal gray. For 3 days, it fell without ceasing, a steady, relentless drumming on the roofs and a constant roar in the pines. The snow vanished, not into a gentle melt, but into a churning slurry of mud and water. The ground became a sodden sponge, unable to absorb another drop. Everyone's eyes were on the river. The Elk, normally a respectable, well-behaved ribbon of water, was transformed into a raging, muddy beast. It swelled and churned, its voice a low, constant growl that was audible even from the boarding house. It gnawed at its banks, pulling down ancient cottonwoods and carrying them along like twigs in its brown, roiling current. A tense, anxious quiet fell over the town. People spoke in low tones, their face etched with a familiar, frontier-bred worry. They were at the mercy of the elements, a truth they lived with every day, but rarely was it so nakedly on display. Nora found herself unable to rest. She watched from the window of the common room as the water crept higher, swallowing the low-lying meadows where she and Reese had ridden. Reese himself was a constant presence, moving between the town and the ranch, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He checked on the livestock, reinforced the lower paddock fences, and spoke in clipped tones with the other men of the town. They were preparing for the worst. their movements economical and purposeful. The worst came on the third night. Nora was jolted from a light, uneasy sleep by a sound unlike any she had ever heard. It was not the roar of the river, but a deep, groaning tremor that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, followed by a deafening, explosive crash. The whole boarding house shuddered. Before she could even process the sound, shouts erupted from the town below. A man's voice, raw with terror, split the night. "The bank's gone. It's gone." Nora was already pulling on her boots, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. She grabbed her medical bag and ran downstairs. Reese was there, pulling on a heavy oilskin slicker, a coiled rope already slung over one shoulder. A lantern in his other hand cast wild, dancing shadows on the walls. He looked at her, and in that one swift glance, an entire conversation passed between them. There was no need for questions. Trouble had come, and they would meet it. "Stay on the high ground unless I say otherwise," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear above the din. "Don't step where you can't see the bottom." They burst out into a world of chaos. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets, and the roar of the water was now a physical presence, a vibration that shook the air. The lower part of town, where a handful of smaller cabins sat near what used to be the riverbank, was gone. In its place was a churning, debris-filled torrent. A whole section of the earth had been carved away, and the river was pouring through the gap, a furious, unstoppable tide. The screams for help were thin and desperate against the overwhelming noise. A cabin, ripped from its foundation, bobbed precariously in the current, a lantern still flickering weakly in its single window. People were scrambling onto their roofs, their figures silhouetted against the dark, churning water. Reese was already moving, his focus absolute. He was not a man given to panic. He saw the chaos and broke it down into a series of practical, immediate tasks. "That's the Miller cabin," he yelled to Nora over the roar, pointing to the floating structure. "Their boy, Tim, is in there with his mother." It was the family Nora had helped, the boy who had called for her, the woman whose burned arm she had tended. Reese handed her his lantern. "Hold this, keep it steady." He worked with a speed and efficiency that was breathtaking. He secured one end of his rope to the thick trunk of a pine that stood on the edge of the new, crumbling bank. He waded into the churning water, testing his footing, the current immediately sucking and pulling at his legs. The water was a maelstrom of uprooted trees, broken fence posts, and the sad, lost detritus of people's lives. He moved slowly, deliberately, a bastion of strength against the flood's mindless fury. Nora stood on the bank, the rain plastering her hair to her face, her knuckles white as she held the lantern high. The small circle of light was their only beacon in the terrifying darkness. She watched as Reese fought his way to the cabin, disappearing into the black water up to his chest before finding purchase and pulling himself onto its tilting porch. She saw him smash the window, reach inside, and pull the small, terrified form of the boy out. He tied the rope around the child's waist, then worked his way back, hand over hand, shielding the boy's body with his own as the current tried to rip them away. When they reached the bank, Nora grabbed the boy, pulling him onto the relative safety of the muddy ground. He was soaked and shivering, but blessedly unharmed. "My ma!" he cried, his small body trembling violently. "He's going back for her," Nora said, her voice a firm reassurance. She wrapped her own woolen shawl around the child, her mind already cataloging the symptoms of shock. Reese made the perilous journey again, and a few minutes later returned with the boy's mother. Nora's makeshift aid station on the muddy rise was quickly growing. She worked on instinct, her hands sure and steady despite the chaos. She checked for injuries, treated cuts and bruises, and wrapped the shivering survivors in any dry blankets that could be found. For hours, they worked in the heart of the storm. Reese, with a few other brave men from the town, performed the brutal, physical work of rescue, while Nora provided the immediate care that kept shock from turning deadly. She was everywhere at once, her calm voice cutting through the panic, her hands bringing order to the chaos. She set a young man's broken arm using a piece of splintered planking as a splint. She cleaned and dressed a deep gash on an old man's head, her stitches neat and sure even in the flickering, uncertain lantern light. They found another man half buried in a tangle of debris near the edge of the floodwater. He was unconscious, a nasty wound on his forehead, and one of his legs was twisted at an impossible angle. "Don't move him," Nora commanded as Reese and another man reached for him. "His leg is broken. We move him wrong, and we could sever an artery." Under her clear, concise direction, they fashioned a stretcher from a broken door. She stabilized the man's leg as best she could, her touch gentle but firm. As they carried him to higher ground, he began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. He looked from the terrifying scene of destruction to Nora's face, illuminated by the lantern, rain dripping from her hair, his eyes wide with pain and confusion, filled with a kind of reverent awe. You're an angel," he gasped, his hand weakly reaching for hers. Nora shook her head, never pausing in her work of checking his pupils. "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the storm. "I'm just the one who didn't leave." The words were a simple statement of fact, but they resonated with a profound truth. She was the one who had stayed with the dying, the one who had run toward the disaster. It was the core of who she was. By dawn, the rain had lessened to a miserable drizzle, and the river, though still dangerously high, had stopped its relentless rise. The sun came up on a scene of utter devastation. A great brown scar had been carved through the town, littered with the wreckage of homes and lives. But amid the mud and ruin, something new was taking root. The townspeople, their faces haggard and smudged with dirt, were working together. The old lines of suspicion and gossip had been washed away by the flood. They were simply survivors, bound by a shared ordeal. The saloon was turned into a makeshift infirmary, and Nora was its undisputed commander. For the next 2 days, she worked tirelessly, barely stopping to eat or rest, tending to the injured, dispensing medicine, and offering a quiet, steady comfort to the distraught. On the 3rd day after the flood, the town gathered in what was left of the main street. Mr. Vance, the elder who had first written to her, stood on a crate and called for order. "We have seen the worst of what this land can throw at us," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "And we have seen the best of what we can be. We have lost homes, but we have not lost a single soul. And for that, we have 2 people, among many brave souls, to thank." He looked at Reese, who stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed, his face impassive. Then he looked at Nora. "This woman," Vance continued, his voice ringing with conviction, "came to us a stranger, but she has shown us a courage and a skill that has saved lives. It's not right that she is just a guest among us. I propose we form a town health council to be prepared for such things in the future, and I propose that its first official member be Nurse Nora Lee." A chorus of assent rose from the crowd. It wasn't a polite agreement. It was a roar of heartfelt, unanimous approval. The woman whose arm Nora had saved was crying openly. Jedediah Stone was clapping his large hands together. Nora stood, stunned, a dizzying wave of emotion washing over her. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the same faces that had once looked away from her in the street, and saw only gratitude and acceptance. They were not just accepting her, they were claiming her as one of their own. Later that evening, after the meeting had dispersed and a weary quiet had once more fallen over the town, Nora found Reese by the paddock, checking on the horses. He had said nothing during the meeting, had offered no words of congratulations after. She stood beside him at the fence, watching the horses move like dark shadows in the twilight. "You were very brave," she said softly. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It was just work that needed doing," he replied, his usual gruff dismissal. They stood in silence for a long time. The sky was clear, awash with the pale, gentle colors of sunset. The air was clean, washed by the rain. Finally. Reese turned his head and looked at her. He didn't smile, but his eyes, in the soft light, held a warmth and an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her for a long, long time, a look that seemed to travel the entire distance from the frightened woman who had stepped off the train to the woman who now stood before him, the trusted heart of the town. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. "You're not a temporary resident," he said. "You're part of this place now." His words settled over her, not like a brand, but like a foundation stone. "You're part of this place now." In the weeks that followed, Nora discovered the truth of it in 100 small ways. The title the town had given her, Member of the Health Council, was less a formal position and more a simple acknowledgement of the role she already filled. The front room of the general store now had a corner partitioned off with a clean cotton sheet, a space that was unequivocally hers. It held a cot, a small table, and her expanding collection of herbs and medical supplies. The people of Elk Hollow no longer averted their eyes when she approached. They met her gaze with a respectful nod, a quiet smile. They brought her their ailments: a child's croupy cough, a woodsman's festering cut, an old woman's aching joints, not with the fearful reluctance of those seeking a last resort, but with the simple trust of a community turning to one of its own. She was their nurse. The title was a plain, sturdy thing, and she wore it with a quiet pride that was entirely new to her. This new life was a fragile, beautiful structure built on the foundations of shared hardship and mutual respect. She found herself breathing easier, sleeping deeper. The old, ever-present knot of anxiety in her stomach had begun to dissolve, replaced by a calm sense of purpose. Her past in Kansas felt like a distant, monochrome memory from another woman's life. She was healing, not just the town's bodies, but her own scarred soul. The past, however, has a way of refusing to stay buried. It arrived on a Tuesday, on the dusty, rumbling stagecoach that brought the mail and the occasional new face from the east. Its arrival was an event, and a small crowd had gathered outside the general store, awaiting news or letters from the world beyond their mountain valley. Nora was there, talking with Mrs. Gable about an order of carbolic acid she needed. When the stage door swung open, a man stepped out, and a breath of cold, familiar air seemed to follow him from the coach's dark interior. He was not a man of the West. His suit was of a fine, dark wool, now dusty from the trail but clearly expensive. He wore polished city shoes, wholly unsuited for the muddy street, and held a leather satchel in one hand. His face was clean-shaven, his features sharp and pinched with disapproval as he surveyed the rustic town. Nora froze, the half-finished sentence to Mrs. Gable dying on her lips. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, coiled in her stomach. She knew him. It was Mr. Abernathy, the administrator of the county infirmary in Kansas, the man who had managed the budgets and the reputations, who had never once set foot in the consumptive ward but had always looked at her with a mixture of pity and distaste, as if she were a necessary but unpleasant tool. He scanned the small crowd, his eyes passing over the rough-spun farmers and ranchers until they landed on her. A flicker of unpleasant recognition crossed his face, followed by a tightening of his jaw. He started toward her, his movement stiff with a self-important authority that was entirely out of place in the easygoing atmosphere of Elk Hollow. Nora felt a primal urge to flee, to turn and run and hide in the safety of the boarding house. The old shame, the feeling of being tainted and judged, rose in her like a phantom limb, an ache she had thought was long gone. Then she felt a presence at her side. Reese had been leaning against a support pillar on the porch, watching the stage arrive. He had seen Abernathy, had seen the look on Nora's face, and had moved to stand near her. He didn't speak or touch her, but his silent, solid presence was a bulwark against the rising tide of her fear. "Miss Lee," Abernathy said, his voice as thin and sharp as she remembered. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her plain, practical dress with disdain. "I must confess, I am surprised to find you here. We had all assumed you had simply disappeared." The townsfolk, sensing a confrontation, grew quiet. "Mrs." Gable took a subtle step closer to Nora's side. "Mr. Abernathy," Nora replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. "This is a long way from home for you." "Indeed," he sniffed, his eyes darting around at the curious faces watching them. "I am here on business, assessing the prospects for a new land venture." Imagine my astonishment when I heard tell of a nurse, a heroine no less, and discovered it to be none other than the woman who abandoned her post in my infirmary. His voice grew louder, taking on a declamatory tone meant for the audience he had gathered. "That is what you did. You know, you ran away. You left us in the lurch, shirked your solemn duty. And in doing so, you sullied the reputation of the very institution that gave you a place. You were a symbol of our charity, and you repaid it by deserting your post." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to pierce the fragile peace she had built. In Kansas, these words would have shattered her. She would have bowed her head, accepted the shame, and retreated into silence. She could feel Reese beside her, could feel the anger radiating from him. He took a half-step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body tensing to intervene, to put himself between her and this venomous ghost from her past. But then he stopped. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her spine, at the calm that was settling over her features, and in an act of profound, powerful trust, he held his ground, allowing her the space to fight her own battle. He would be her witness, her silent guard, but this ghost was hers to exercise. Nora took a slow, steadying breath. She looked not at Abernathy's accusing face, but past him, at the faces of the people of El Calo. She saw Jedediah Stone, whose horse she had saved, his expression a thunderous scowl. She saw the young mother whose arm she'd treated, holding her small son's hand, her eyes flashing with a protective fire. She saw a dozen other faces, men and women she had helped, whose hands she had held, who had welcomed her into their lives. They were her people now. This was her home, and in her home, she would not be shamed. She turned her gaze back to Abernathy. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, weary clarity. "I didn't run away. Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush. "I survived." She took a step forward, and it was Abernathy who flinched back. "I survived the sickness you wrote about in your ledgers but never dared to witness. I survived the whispers of a town that feared me and the isolation of a duty that no one else would perform. I held the hands of the dying because you and the others were too afraid to, when my work there was done. I did not run. I sought a place where I could continue to do the work, a place that needed a nurse, not a symbol of charity." She looked around at the faces of her town. "I came here to heal the sick, not to polish the reputation of a building." Abernathy stood, his mouth slightly agape, his prepared speech rendered meaningless. He had expected a shamed, timid girl, and instead, he had found a woman made of iron. He looked to the crowd, seeking the censure and judgment he had always wielded so effectively. He found none. All he saw was a wall of cold, unyielding stares. "She belongs here," Jedediah Stone said, his voice a low growl. "She's our nurse, Mrs." Gable added, her arms crossed firmly over her chest. One by one, they closed ranks around her, not with threats, but with a silent, immovable solidarity. They stood with her, a human shield forged of loyalty and shared experience. Abernathy looked from face to face, and the arrogant certainty began to drain from his own. His accusations had no purchase here. His authority was a foreign currency, utterly worthless. He sputtered for a moment, his face turning a blotchy red. "Well, the ingratitude, Without another word, He turned on his heel and marched back to the stagecoach, his humiliated retreat far more telling than any admission of defeat. The driver, who had witnessed the entire exchange with a wry grin, tipped his hat to Nora as Abernathy climbed inside and slammed the door. The coach rumbled away, carrying her past back down the dusty road, leaving only a profound, ringing silence in its wake. That night, the full weight of the day descended upon Nora. The victory felt hollow, the confrontation having unearthed years of buried pain. She sat in the common room of the boarding house long after Mr. Maggs had gone to bed. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on the quiet room. She thought of the years of loneliness, of the countless nights spent as the sole occupant of her own small, isolated world. The confrontation had not been just about Abernathy. It had been about every averted gaze, every whispered comment, every hand that had recoiled from hers. The town's support had been a healing balm, but it had been applied to a wound that was deeper than she had ever acknowledged. And for the first time since she had arrived in Elk Hollow, she began to cry. It was not a loud, theatrical weeping. It was a silent, wrenching grief. Her shoulders shook with sobs she could no longer contain, tears of loss and relief mingling as they traced hot paths down her cheeks. It was a mourning for the woman she had been, and a release into the woman she was becoming. She did not hear Reese come down the stairs. She only sensed his presence as he stopped a few feet away, a large, dark shape in the fire glow. He stood there for a long time, simply watching her, granting her the dignity of her sorrow. He did not offer clumsy words of comfort. He knew, with that deep, quiet wisdom of his, that words were useless against such a profound and necessary grief. When her sobs began to quiet, leaving only the shuddering aftermath, he moved. He walked to stand in front of her chair. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears, and saw him looking down at her, his face full of a tenderness she had never seen before. He did not speak. He did not have to. He simply opened his arms. It was an invitation, a silent, unconditional offer of shelter. It was the promise of, "I'll start slow," brought to its gentle, patient conclusion. For Nora, this was the final, most terrifying step, to be held after a lifetime of being untouchable. The thought of an embrace was both a desperate yearning and a paralyzing fear. She looked at his open arms, at the safe, steady harbor they offered. She saw the patience in his eyes, the complete absence of any demand. He would wait. Slowly, shakily, she rose from her chair. She took one hesitant step, then another, and then, for the first time in her life, Nora Lee stepped into someone's arms. The embrace was not what she had imagined. It was not a crushing, passionate act. It was simply solid, real. His arms closed around her, holding her with a strength that felt like safety itself. She rested her cheek against the rough wool of his shirt, and the steady, quiet beat of his heart was the most reassuring sound she had ever heard. He held her as she trembled, his large hands resting gently on her back, offering nothing but a profound and unwavering support. He was not trying to fix her sorrow. He was simply sharing its weight. In the circle of his arms, the last of the ice around Nora's heart finally broke, and for the first time, she felt what it was to not be alone. She was home. That first embrace, born of grief and offered in silence, did not open a floodgate of easy affection. Instead, it created a new landscape between them, a quiet, shimmering space full of unspoken possibility and a profound, terrifying vulnerability. The memory of it lived in Nora's skin, the feeling of his arms around her, the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was a sensory imprint she returned to again and again in the quiet moments of the day. It had been a shelter in a storm of sorrow. But now, in the calm that followed, she was unsure how to navigate the world where such a thing was possible. They did not speak of it. To give it words would have been to capture a wild, beautiful thing and put it in a cage. But it was there, in every shared silence, in every glance that lingered a moment too long. A new awareness hummed in the air between them, as tangible as the heat from the fire. Nora found herself watching his hands as he mended a piece of leather, noticing the strength and gentleness in them, and her breath would catch in her throat. He would watch her as she read by the firelight, his gaze so steady and intense that she could feel it like a touch, and a warmth would spread through her that had nothing to do with the flames. The town of Elk Hollow, now her town, was settling into the deep, muddy peace of spring. The rhythm of life was slow and deliberate. Her days were full. There was always a poultice to be mixed, a worried mother to be reassured, a wound to be dressed. She had found her purpose, her place, but her nights were different. After Mags had retired. The common room would become their space, a silent theater for the quiet, unfolding story between them. One evening, a week after the confrontation with Abernathy, they sat in their now familiar arrangement. She was in the worn armchair by the fire, mending a tear in one of her aprons, and he was on the opposite side of the hearth, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shlick, shlick of steel on stone, a soothing, meditative sound. The fire cast a warm, golden glow, softening the hard edges of the room and painting his face in light and shadow. Nora paused in her sewing, her needle hovering over the cloth. She watched the firelight play on the silver line of his scar, a mark of the pain he had endured, a pain he had named in order to quell her own fears. He had been half burned alive. What was left to be afraid of? But she was still afraid. The memory of his arms around her was a comfort, yet the thought of any other touch filled her with a deep, primal panic. It was a paradox that lived in her heart, a desperate longing for connection, and an equally desperate fear of it. She had been untouchable for so long that the very idea of skin against skin felt like a violation, a breaking of a sacred, lonely law she had lived by her entire life. As if sensing her gaze, Rhys stopped his work. The rhythmic scraping of the whetstone ceased, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was deep and resonant. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and direct in the firelight. He saw the needle stilled in her hand, the troubled, distant look in her eyes. He saw the faint, lingering sadness that clung to her like a fine mist. Slowly, deliberately, he set the knife and the whetstone on the mantelpiece. He did not rise, but he turned in his chair to face her more fully. He rested his forearms on his knees, his hands clasped loosely between them. "You're a long way away tonight, Nora," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had used her given name when they were alone. The sound of it, spoken in his deep, quiet voice, was a soft touch in itself. She lowered her hands to her lap, the apron and needle forgotten. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About Kansas?" he asked. He did not need to be told. He knew the ghosts that haunted her. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "About how different this is." He watched her, his expression patient, allowing her to find her words. "For all those years," she said, her gaze dropping to the fire, "the only way I could survive was to build a wall around myself. A thick one. It kept the whispers and the looks out, but it kept everything else out, too. I don't know how to live without it." "You don't have to," he said simply. "You just have to learn how to build a gate." His words, plain and practical as always, held a profound wisdom that cut straight to the heart of her fear. A gate, a way to let someone in without tearing down the entire wall. He saw a single tear escape her control, tracing a glistening path down her cheek in the firelight. His expression softened. All the harshness, all the weathered stoicism, seemed to melt away, leaving only a deep, unguarded tenderness in his eyes. Slowly, as if not to startle a fawn, he rose from his chair. He took 2 steps across the hearth rug that separated them and knelt on one knee before her chair. He was so close now. She could feel the heat of his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of pine and leather that always clung to him. Her heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. He was too close. The walls were closing in. He lifted his hand. It moved through the air with an agonizing slowness, a clear, deliberate motion that gave her ample time to pull away. He was not trying to trap her. He was offering a choice. His calloused, scarred fingers, the fingers of a man who worked with horses and ropes, rose toward her face. His intention was simple, pure. He meant only to wipe away the tear, a small, instinctive gesture of comfort. But as his fingertips brushed against the soft skin of her cheek, a jolt, sharp and electric as a lightning strike, shot through her. It was not a jolt of pleasure. It was a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. She flinched back so violently that her head hit the wooden frame of the armchair. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips, and she pressed herself deep into the chair, her hands flying up to her chest as if to ward off a blow. Her eyes were wide, her breath coming in short, panicked pants. Reese froze, his hands suspended in the air between them. The shock on his face was immediately replaced by a look of deep, profound hurt. He had misread everything. He had crossed a line. He slowly pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist as if to contain the gesture he had offered. The silence in the room was a raw, gaping wound. Nora looked at his face, at the pain she had caused, and her own heart shattered. He thought she was afraid of him. He thought she was rejecting him. "No," she whispered, her voice a ragged, desperate sound. "No, it's not you. It's not you. Reese, please." Tears were flowing freely now, born of shame and a desperate need to make him understand. She struggled for the words, for the explanation that could possibly bridge the chasm that had just opened between them. "That night, when you held me," she stammered, her gaze fixed on his face, pleading with him to believe her. "That was different. I was falling apart, and you were just there. A safe place, solid. But this, a touch like that." Her voice broke. She took a shuddering breath. "No one's ever touched me before." She saw him process the words, saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes. He was remembering the embrace, the full body contact he had given her. "I don't mean held," she clarified, her voice desperate. "I mean, just a touch, for its own sake, to be kind. No one has ever just touched my face." And then he understood. He understood the profound, terrifying difference. The hug had been an act of anonymous, desperate shelter. This had been an act of intimate, personal connection. It was the gate she didn't know how to open. The hurt in his eyes was replaced by a wave of understanding so deep, so complete, that it took her breath away. He was not looking at a woman who had rejected him. He was looking at a wild, wounded creature, terrified by the first gentle hand it had ever known. He rose slowly to his feet, not to retreat, but to give them both a moment of space. He turned his back to her and walked the few steps to the wall where his coat hung on a peg. He took it down, for a heart-stopping moment. She thought he was going to leave, that she had broken the fragile trust between them beyond repair. But he didn't put it on. He simply held it in his hands for a moment, then draped it over the back of his chair. He was removing a layer, a barrier. He was making himself as vulnerable as she was. He turned back to her. He walked to her chair and knelt before her again, just as he had before. He did not try to touch her face. He did not try to do anything but meet her terrified gaze with his own steady one. He leaned in close, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, and he whispered the words that had become their creed, their promise. "I'll start slow." It was not a repetition. It was a renewal. It was him telling her that her fear had not scared him away. It had simply shown him where the beginning truly was. He did not reach for her face. He did not open his arms for an embrace. He simply held out his own hand, palm facing up, an open, patient offering. It was a question, asked without a single word. Nora looked down at his hand. It was large, calloused, scarred from a life of hard work and old pain. It was the hand that had held a rope to save a child from a flood. It was the hand that had helped her set a horse's broken bone. It was the hand that had taught her how to hold the reins. It was a good hand, a safe hand. Her own hand was trembling in her lap. To lift it, to move it across the small space and place it in his, felt like the most monumental journey of her life. It was a leap of faith across a chasm of fear. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, not with a possessive grip, but with a gentle, encompassing warmth. His skin was rough against hers, a grounding, solid reality. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply held her hand. They stayed that way for the rest of the night. Rhys did not return to his chair. He remained kneeling on the rug before her, and she remained in her chair. Their hands joined between them. The fire burned down to ash, and the room grew cool. But the warmth from their linked hands was enough. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the deep, profound quiet of the house, the silence became their language, a gentle, unspoken agreement. It was the first tentative opening of the gate. Spring did not arrive in Elk Hollow. It seeped in, a slow and gentle tide of warmth that pushed back the long, hard winter. It was in the sound of water, a constant, musical trickle as the last of the snow melted from the high country and swelled the river, which now ran clean and swift within its new flood-carved banks. It was in the scent of the air, the cold, sterile purity of winter replaced by the rich, complex perfume of damp earth, budding aspen, and pine resin warming in the sun. It was in the light, a pale, golden wash that lingered longer each evening, chasing the deep, oppressive shadows from the valley floor. For Nora, it felt like the world was finally catching up to the season that had already begun in her own heart. The hand she had placed in Rhys's that night had not been withdrawn. It had become the new, quiet center of their world. They did not walk through town holding hands, nor did they engage in public displays of affection. Theirs was a language spoken in a register too low for others to hear. It was in the way he would wait for her now at the end of the day. His shoulder leaned against the porch pillar. His presence a silent question she would answer with a small, soft smile. It was in the way her gaze would seek his across a crowded room, finding in his steady, gray eyes a safe and quiet harbor. The corner of the general store that had been her makeshift clinic was no longer enough. After the flood, the town, in its gruff, practical way, had decided their nurse needed a proper place. They had cleared out the small, long-abandoned assay office next to the smithy. The men had replaced the broken window panes and patched the roof, and the women had scrubbed the single room from floor to ceiling, hanging clean, simple curtains over the window. It wasn't a building so much as a promise kept. Nora had moved her supplies into the small, sunlit space, arranging her jars of herbs and tins of salves on newly built wooden shelves. The room smelled of carbolic acid, dried lavender, and beeswax. It was a scent of clean, ordered healing, and it was the first space in her entire life that had been unequivocally hers. She was no longer a temporary resident in someone else's world. She had put down roots in the rich, dark soil of Elk Hollow. The gate Rhys had spoken of had not been flung open, but it was no longer barred. She had learned to open it a little at a time, to trust the quiet strength of its hinges. There were still moments, rare and fleeting, when an unexpected touch would make her flinch the brush of a hand in the crowded store. A child grabbing her skirts, but the panic that followed was a pale ghost of what it had once been. It no longer sent her retreating behind her walls. Instead, she would feel the memory of Rhys's hand holding hers in the dark, a steady, grounding anchor in a world that was no longer so terrifying. One afternoon, when the sun was high and warm, bathing the valley in a clear, brilliant light, she was sweeping the wooden floor of her new clinic. The door was propped open, and a gentle breeze carried the sounds of the town, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter of children, the soft nicker of a horse. She felt a shadow fall across the doorway and looked up. Reese was there, leaning against the frame, silhouetted against the bright day. He was not in his work clothes. He wore a clean shirt, and he had taken the time to brush the dust from his hat. He was holding the reins of a single horse, a handsome bay that stood patiently behind him. He watched her for a moment, a rare, soft light in his eyes. He had been watching her for months, first with a neutral curiosity, then with a grudging respect, then with a fierce, protective tenderness. Now, he simply watched her with a quiet, profound contentment. He was watching a woman who had come to his town a broken, frightened thing and had, through her own grit and grace, made herself whole. "The work is done for the day," he said, his voice a low, easy rumble. He straightened up from the doorframe and gestured with his head toward the sun-drenched valley that stretched out beyond the town. Nora leaned her broom against the wall, her heart giving a slow, steady thump against her ribs. She smoothed the front of her apron, a gesture that was once one of nervous anxiety but was now simply one of habit. She looked at the single horse, then back at him. The question was unspoken, but it hung in the warm spring air between them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. The question was so simple, so vast. It wasn't just about a ride. It was about a future. It was him, handing her the reins to her own life, a life that was now inextricably bound with his. She looked past him, at the greening trails that wound their way up into the high country, at the endless blue sky. She could go anywhere. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, at the man who had seen her at her most broken and had not turned away. She thought of his patience, of the slow, careful way he had dismantled her fears, one gentle act at a time. He had always let her set the pace. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and full of a trust that was absolute. "If I sit behind you," she asked, her voice soft but sure, "will you dare to go slow?" A look of deep, profound understanding passed over his face. He knew she wasn't talking about the horse. He was hearing the echo of his own promise, the one he had made in the dark of a winter's night. He was seeing the culmination of their long, quiet journey. He walked to her, his boots making a soft sound on the wooden floor. He stopped just before her, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. He reached out and, with a gentleness that still made her breath catch, he took her hand. This time, she did not flinch. She simply turned her hand in his, her fingers lacing with his own. He brought her hand to his lips and brushed a soft kiss across her knuckles, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar joy. He leaned in close, his voice a low, private whisper meant only for her. "Nora," he said, the sound of her name a warm caress. "I've been going slow since the moment I met you." He led her outside into the bright sunshine, with a strength that was effortless. He placed his hands on her waist and lifted her, swinging her up onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. He mounted behind her, his body a solid, warm presence against her back. The world, which had for so long felt vast and empty, now felt perfectly, wonderfully full. She hesitated for a moment. Then, with a new and quiet confidence, she placed her hands on his lean waist, her fingers resting on the worn leather of his belt. His arms came around her to take the reins, enclosing her in a circle of strength and safety. They rode out from the clinic, not toward the wild trails, but down the center of the main street. They rode past the general store, where Mrs. Gable stood on the porch, a wide, knowing smile on her face. They rode past the smithy, and the blacksmith paused in his work, lifting his hammer in a silent salute. They rode past the saloon, past the boarding house, past all the small, familiar landmarks of her new life. No one stared with suspicion. There were no whispers. There were only the quiet, approving nods of a town that was watching two of its own. Their quiet, hard-won love story finally brought out into the light. They left the town behind, and the trail began to climb. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The sun warmed her back, and the steady, rhythmic gait of the horse was a soothing, peaceful motion. She leaned back slightly, resting against the solid wall of his chest. He was, as he had promised, going slow, allowing her to savor every moment, every sight, every sound. Nora looked out at the valley unfolding below them, a patchwork of green and brown under an endless sky. She was sitting tall, her back straight, no longer the hunched, invisible woman who had stepped off the train in the dead of winter. The wind touched her face, and it felt like a caress. The warmth of the sun on her skin felt like a blessing. The solid presence of the man behind her, his steady breathing, the secure circle of his arms, felt like the answer to a prayer she had never known how to speak. She was no longer afraid of a hand on her cheek, a touch on her arm. She had learned, with a patience that matched his own, that a touch could be a home. She had learned how to be loved. It had all begun with a whisper in the dark, a promise made to a frightened woman by a man who understood the language of scars, a promise to start slow. And in that slowness, she had found everything. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.